Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you look up to see what it is that could be blocking the sun. A flap of wind hits your face as a large shadow passes behind the mountain. Choosing to ignore the roar echoing across the canyons, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside, you find a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether it's better to face off against a Hungarian horntail or a Norwegian ridgeback. In a corner, by the fire, are two men. One is explaining why the movie version of How to Train Your Dragon is way better than the book version. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, why don't you rate and review our show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Really helps us a ton. We really appreciate the folks who take the time to do that. And now let's talk about this topic for the show, because this is one of those topics where as soon as I see this is happening, it's like, oh, well, obviously we need to have a show on this. And the topic is dragons. And I'm guessing if you're the sort of person who listens to a podcast like Believe to See, you're also the sort of person who really enjoys a good dragon tale. So when we saw that Junius Johnson, friend of Anselm, and who's been one of the longtime fellows and contributors and sort of part of the brain trust behind Anselm, was teaching a class on dragons, well, like I said, obviously we're going to have him on. So Junius Johnson, welcome back to the table. Welcome to Believe to See.
Thank you.
All right. So, Junius, you have been on a previous episode of the podcast. And like I said, if folks are familiar with Anselm, there's a good chance they're familiar with you as well. But let's do a little bit of background. Please tell the folks at home who you are, what you do, and also where did all this dragon interest come from?
Yeah, so I'm a scholar, particularly of theological material and especially of medieval theological material. Spent a lot of my time thinking about how to make really rigorous and detailed accounts of Christian theological belief. And by rigorous, I usually mean philosophically rigorous. I have this belief that if all the things we say about God are true, and I think they are, then the hardest thing for humans to think about, the biggest, most difficult topic, is not going to be rocket science. It's not going to be quantum physics. It's actually going to be the Trinity, because that's something that infinitely exceeds our capacity to know. So I find it super interesting that super excellent Trinitarian God has stooped to speak to us in our languages and in our concepts and invited us into some of that knowing. So that's what I do with my professional work, is my scholarly work, is to try to just answer that call, to respond to the invitation and think along after God, of what God has revealed of God's self as much as I can, and to just worship with my mind in that way. But I also don't think that God gives us gifts of intellect and creativity and these things so that we can take those talents and bury them in the ground. They're given for us and for our encouragement and for our joy, but they're also given for the church, and then broader than that, for the world. And so as I think about how do I take all of this reflection and other sorts of things and bring that, answer that part of the call to come and share that talent, put it to work so that it can earn interest and multiply, that issues naturally in teaching. And I've done that in all sorts of settings: public school, private classical schools, universities. But these days I'm doing my teaching online. I've got a teaching business that I'm running, Junius Johnson Academics, which is aimed at taking some of the stuff that I've been able to do at elite seminaries and universities and make that available to a broader audience. So you don't have to be engaged in a massive degree program and spending all of your life savings and your kids' life savings to get this thing done. So that's kind of who I am and what I'm doing lately. The dragons part of the question, I mean, it's almost, I think I have to cheat and just borrow from Chesterton here, right? I mean, Chesterton argues in an essay in the magnificent book Tremendous Trifles. If you've not read Tremendous Trifles, do yourself a favor, pick up a copy and just dive in, because it is just page after page of just pure joy and delight. But in a very famous essay, he says something very famous about dragons, which is that children don't need to be told that dragons exist. Children always know that dragons exist. That's just one of the pieces of information that's properly basic to childhood. If you're a human child, you know there's such a thing as dragons. And so the famous bit is he says, fairy tales don't teach the child about dragons. They show the child that dragons can be beaten. And so that really feels right to me. And there wasn't a moment that I can think, oh my gosh, I fell in love with dragons. For as long as I can remember knowing that there were such things as dragons, I remember being incredibly interested in them and thinking that they were probably about the coolest thing ever. I think that's kind of analytic to the idea of a dragon. Anselm, our patron, said that God is that than which nothing greater could be conceived. And so he wants to say, if you really understand the idea of God rightly, you're going to think that God exists, and you're going to think that God is great, and you're going to want to be a part of that. If that's not true of you, if all those things don't describe you, then you don't know what we mean when we say God yet. I kind of feel that way about dragons. If you really know what we're on about, if you really know what I mean when I say the word dragon, I have a hard time imagining that you're not interested in that you wouldn't want to know more about that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to kick it off. First of all, thank you for pointing me to a G.K. Chesterton work that I had not read yet. That is going to the top of my reading list. And I want to dive into dragons, but first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with like juniusjohnson.com and your teaching style. You said something, I think, in a previous Anselm talk that really stuck with me. If I butcher anything, please correct the record. But I believe you're talking about how when you were like an undergrad or trying to find your way as a new scholar, you're like, okay, do I go this theology route, philosophy, literature? I like all these things. How do I pick a lane? Then you encountered like some of the medieval thinkers like St. Bonaventure. I guess you could throw Anselm in there, like, oh, you can do all three at once. And it's something so beautiful, and it works together. And it seems like that's something you're doing here with these dragons courses you've been teaching. Is that right?
That's exactly right. For me, it's all about, I've never understood separating things off and dissecting things up. Obviously, we have to specialize because there's a great deal of particular knowledge it takes to do any of these things well. But a theologian who doesn't read literature is probably a theologian without sufficient joy and wonder in his or her soul. And a theologian who doesn't read philosophy is probably a theologian who's risking incoherence at every step. These things, they just go together for me. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way, but in my soul, theology flows naturally into and out of literature and philosophy and music and several other things. In essence, all of us as humans, we have all these desires and interests that we do, and that's part of how we're built, that when God knit our souls together wonderfully, he sewed into them interests in these various things. And so oftentimes outsiders look and they say, well, how do you put together this and that? And I don't see how those two things can go together at all. And even if we can't articulate how they go together, we know they do, because the place where the things come together is not in the account we can give of them to somebody else. It's in our souls. And so the human soul is the type of thing that can bind together things that otherwise would seem to be quite disparate and separate. So anyway, for me, I'm always looking at, all right, how do I take these different types of things that I always want to talk about and begin to bring them together into a single conversation where I can invite people to see some of the connections that I get really excited about. What it's all about at the end of the day is something my mom said to me when I was growing up, and I think a lot of people's moms may have said something like this to them. I was I'm an introvert, I was a little bit of a loner kid, and so she always encouraged me to go out and make friends, right? And so at the time, I thought she meant that I should go become friends with other people. But as I grew in sophistication and sophistry, I decided that what she must mean was to create the kind of people who could be my friends, because I wasn't encountering enough of them in the world. And so it's a sneaky thing, but it's really what my teaching is always about. It's, hey, I think this stuff is really cool. Are there any people out there who want to talk with me about this stuff? And if so, let's come up with an excuse and sit down and do it.
Yeah, and that seems to be a lot of what you're doing with your latest project here with obviously you have your course on dragons that you're teaching, but these are open for registration. Anyone can join onto the class. You get the syllabus, you have all the stuff. So you have so much experience in these, elite academic institutions. What's it been like transitioning to doing this, like sort of more of a broadcast for your teaching?
It's been really great. One of the things that I always get when I'm talking to my friends is I tell them, I'll post on social media, doing this class this semester on this. And people always write and say, oh, I wish I could take that. Is there any way that I could take it from a distance and whatnot. And before the pandemic, I was always something of a purist. I'm gonna say, no, it's impossible. It can't be done. It wouldn't be any good. But we've all had this kind of really forcible proof of concept about distance learning, and I saw that the time is right, both socially and technologically, that it's very easy to host live classes, discussion-based classes. It's very painless. No one has to buy specialized equipment. Just stuff that we all have lying around. We can get on and we can have these conversations from anywhere in the world. And so that was really exciting to me, to think that the barrier of, it's a certain form of elitism, right? To have the privilege of having access to top scholars at Yale or at wherever else, that barrier could be broken down, and that I could say, so you live in Toronto and you live in Colorado Springs and you live in New York City. Doesn't matter. We all want to talk about dragons. Let's get together and do it. And let's do this thing. And so it's been a real joy to be able to have a different type of student than just the 18 to 22-year-old. It's also been a real joy to be able to connect up what I do to lived experience in a way that isn't typically a part of what happens in a university classroom.
When I was Googling you to get on your website, I started typing in Junius Johnson. The first search that came up with it was Junius Johnson Dragons, which I'm guessing would make you happy. That's what Google thinks. So let's talk about this dragon class. So first question is sort of get us in there. It seems like dragons are this pervasive idea that people all across the world, different time periods, different cultures, have this same sort of basic concept of dragon. What do you mean by dragons, and why are they all over the place?
The first question, is a really fun one. I did a talk one time about dragons in which I made the argument that more is required for a dragon than that you be a lizard with wings. And I get a little frustrated with some dragons, and I'll admit the Harry Potter dragons are sometimes this for me. I don't like it when dragons are reduced to just particularly dangerous animals, because to me, one of the key concepts in the notion of dragon is cunningness. And I don't like to see that lost. Now, just because they're not rational doesn't mean they aren't cunning, and so you can find some leeway there. But the question was, what's required for a dragon? And it's hard to put into words. It's one of those things like defining, what are the boundaries of art? But I would say this, whatever it is, whatever it means to be a dragon, an irreducible part of it is that they are more. They're bigger than life. And that's that attaches to them in a way that is integral to the notion of dragon. This is to get the pervasiveness of it in two ways. I think there's both a historical and a, shall we say, conceptual or even archetypal reason for the pervasiveness of it. Historically, the reason dragons are so, pervasive might not even be strong enough, right? Ubiquitous. I don't know that there's a culture that doesn't have some sort of dragon or serpent myth. The reason for that is whatever the truth is behind Genesis 3, right? If that's literally true, that there was a serpent that walked on 4 legs and tempted the first humans, or if it's allegorically true, whatever that truth is, there's this important theological truth taught right at the beginning of all of God's revelation to humanity, that these serpents of a very particularly cunning, non-slithering kind play an important role in. And so I think when we talk about and we think about dragons as humans of whatever culture and whatever time, we're thinking along that idea, this notion that there's this primal antagonist and that there's this lasting enmity between their offspring and ours, and that this is a theologically important truth that really kicks off our story. That's the historical angle why I think so. I think we all sort of inherit this fascination with dragons. But then on the archetypal side, it is that whole sense of what dragons stand for, what they represent, that it is the ultimate foe, that it is the archetypal nemesis. And so they take on so much more meaning. It's not just about something that's really hard to kill and really hard to not get killed by, but it's also something to do with majesty and something to do with grandeur and something to do with greatness and magnanimity and courage and all of these other things.
That is a really interesting way to put it. And I think you're right about it being ubiquitous, because it seems like whenever I try to dip my toe into any culture's mythological ecosystem, that there's always a dragon there. And something I hear thrown out a lot, and I'd be interested to see what your perspective on it is, to sort of compare dragons from the West versus dragons in the East. The
Mhm.
typically handed down story is that dragons in the West, so like Europe, are typically antagonists. Like you said, they're the ultimate foe, primal antagonist, whereas dragons in the East tend to be more symbols of good fortune, symbols of of divine favor, things like that. Do you think that's true? That's sort of a good way to break it out? And if so, what do you think that tells us?
I'm not much of an expert on Eastern dragons, unfortunately, but from what I've seen, that does seem to be certainly a good characterization of a trend, right? There's
Hmm.
much more, dragons are much more focused on wisdom and even transcendence in the East than they are in the West. There's a recent collection of short stories about dragons called The Book of Dragons, came out last year, and I'm reading it now, and it's just delightful. Some of the top fantasy writers today contributed to it, and there's a tale there about this Naga Eastern dragon, which is a sage, and so it's up on a mountain meditating, trying to achieve enlightenment, and it's very fascinating. And of course, it actually turns out that this particular one is a prince, and it's time to father is dying. It's time to come back and take over the kingdom and re-enter the world and take on worldly responsibility. And there's this sense of I'm going to lose my progress towards transcendence. I might be reincarnated as a human next life instead of as a dragon, and that's backward motion and these sorts of questions. So there's definitely that angle to it that I really think is very powerful and an important corrective. It's an important piece of what it means to be a dragon, even in the West, that we don't want to lose in our antagonistic dragons. Likewise, though, if there's a sort of yin and yang about Eastern and Western dragons, there is a very sinister undercurrent to dragons in the East. They're a little bit Aslan-like even at their best, right? Where you think, okay, maybe they're good, but they're still not safe. And one still has to be very careful to mind one's manners around a dragon, and there's still a temper there to be awakened that can do things. Or even just the dragons are often responsible for landslides and thunderstorms and these other sorts of things. And it's not that they're doing it out of spite, but just beings of that magnitude, and I don't just mean their physical size, but beings of that metaphysical magnitude, if you will, things like angels whose being is just so much more than human beings. They have this effect on the environment around them that's not always healthy for humans, right? So I like to keep the two in tension, to recognize that we can't just reduce dragons to the biggest, baddest foe, nor can we remove that element and just make them into these helpful sages. They inhabit this uncomfortable middle space that really challenges us to think about, what is it that's safe about wisdom? Isn't wisdom also dangerous? And what is it that's dangerous about fear? Isn't there also something really good and safe about fear? And how do we put those things together?
I like the way you put that, because you can definitely see that in both East and West, where it's easy to sort of blur your eyes and say, okay, dragons in West, bad guys, dragons in East, good guys. But no, if you look at it a little bit deeper, both areas have sort of this duality where there's the greatness, the wisdom, but there's also the danger there. That sort of gets into some of the other elements of the dragons that I wanted to get into. You talked about the wisdom from the dragons, and you can see this in a lot of different examples. I'm sure you can name off a bunch more than me. But why do you think dragons are so associated with wisdom? Because at first it seems kind of weird, like, oh, a giant kind of lizard dinosaur thing with wings is the symbol of wisdom. How did this start off, and what can we learn from seeing this sort of powerful being also being such a centerpiece of wisdom?
Yeah. There might be two ways into it. I mean, I don't know. I don't actually know, but just going to speculate here. And there might be two ways into it. One is that cunning that was a part of Satan in the beginning in the Genesis 3 story, right? And it's described not as a characteristic of Satan per se, but of the serpent. The serpent was cunning above all creatures. And we see this in looking at different types of serpentine and lizard-like animals, how they hunt, how they go about living their lives. There's an awful lot of cunning involved. They're good at disguise. Some of them are quite good at it. They're patient. They're good at laying traps. They wait for just the right moment to strike. All of these things conduce to the notion of wisdom, I think, and especially the idea of waiting for the right moment to strike, knowing exactly when the opportune moment is and going right then. So I think that's one way into it, and that's an important one because it also shows that there's a kind of it's a wisdom which is not necessarily just beneficent. It's a cunning wisdom. And so this know-how that they possess can be turned against us in ways that the heroes need to be careful of. The other way into it is one that I think is also common to East and West, which is just this notion of longevity. In Shakespeare's King Lear, the king is reproached that he should have been wise before he was old. Right? But instead, he's grown old and he's still a fool. There's this connection between age and wisdom, and it seems that the longer you live, the more experience you have. Wisdom comes from experience. No matter how great an idiot you are, if you live for long enough, you ought to pick up some wisdom about some stuff, right? And these dragons typically have seen thousands of years go by. They've seen ages of the world go by, and so it just feels like, the old notion. Gosh, if these walls could talk, what things might they say? Gosh, if those serpents could say what they've seen, how much wisdom might they possess?
Yeah, and so what you said got me thinking. I want to take a quick little maybe like Bible detour before we get back to some of the other dragons in literature to talk about dragons in the Bible, because what you talked about, the serpent in Genesis 1. So obviously we always think, oh, that's the devil, or maybe it's like devil in the form of like a snake, but it sounds like serpent might not be what we think like a snake. And also it seems like if you look through the Old Testament, there's several dragon references where they either use the Hebrew word that could be dragon, or like we have the Leviathan in the book of Job and all these really fascinating things. So what do we make of all these dragons in the Bible?
Yeah. And let's not forget Revelation, where there's the dragon quite comes in full force, right? And it looks a little bit more like what we think of as a dragon there. Mm-hmm. Well, on the one hand, if the serpent of Genesis 3 is the first dragon, as it were, Tolkien's first dragon in Middle Earth is glowering. So if it's the glowering of the Bible, then it's to be expected that, and we're told as a part of the curse that there's going to be this lasting antagonism between the serpent seed and the human seed. And so in a lot of ways, the serpent is right at the heart of the story the Bible is telling, because this is what Christ is coming to free us from. And so the story, this antagonist needs to show up multiple times through the story precisely because the antagonist is part of the plot that's going forward, is part of that which has to be overcome at the end of the day. But what I really love about it, if you connect it to Leviathan, if we do allow that through line to run there, is that what God is saying about Leviathan in Job is that Leviathan obeys the voice of the Lord. That there's a bridle almost that is set on Leviathan, and that it may roll in the waves in joy and spin and gamble in the waves, but at the end of the day, it's doing so to the praise of God. And so then we come to that old serpent in Revelation, and that idea of old, ancient, taking us all the way back to the first pages, to the beginning of the scriptures, to the beginning of history. And you see God's judgment coming down on that serpent and the final defeat of that serpent. And it's all embraced in the story of God allowing a space of freedom for creatures to act, creatures taking that freedom, and in the use of that freedom, whatever use they make of it, willingly or unwillingly giving glory to God, and then ultimately at the end being constrained to the purposes of God. That's kind of a good summary of the whole history of dragons in Western literature. There's a lot of antagonism going on there. There's a lot of helpfulness running through there. They're very ambiguous in a lot of cases, but at the end of the day, you can't imagine the story without them. And you want them in your story, right? I've really not ever had the experience of, oh no, he's just reaching for another dragon. Here we go. It's a dragon again, right? Every single time I get chills and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a dragon. It's like the last vestige of something in me that is alive and well in my very young children, right? I mean, my daughter, it's another unicorn. I have to have it. Yes. Right? Sweetie, you have 12 unicorns, but I don't have this one. It's another one, right? As an adult, we learn to think, oh, it's another unicorn, right? Gosh, just another unicorn. I never quite get there with dragons. They're written too deeply into our story for us to ever really get over them, which is why I think, and I act upon this thought, that they're really well suited to be the catalyst for discussions of everything that is most important to humans, right? Not just our fears, but our hopes, our dreams, all of it.
Yeah, and one of the ways that they can be catalysts for us is, as the antagonist. And as you said, there's a lot more depths to it. But in a lot of, classic works, they are primarily the antagonists. I think that one of the examples is one of the readings you listed on your syllabus, which is the Fairy Queen in Book One, where the Red Cross Knight, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be St. George, battles a dragon who's definitely a personification of like evil or wickedness. So with things like that, which, that's just one example of many, what can we see about what the purpose that the dragons serve and the effect they can have on the protagonist of the story?
There's two things there, at least. One is it's kind of an old trope that Homer was the first one that I'm aware of. He introduced it to the West. And it's a really, really good trope, which is build up the enemy in order to build up the hero, right? And so the gods have gotten Zeus to promise that Troy will be destroyed, and Zeus is like, absolutely, it's totally going to happen. And yet everything Zeus is doing is bringing humiliation to the Greeks and bringing glory to Hector and Troy. And the other gods are just like, what is going on here? This is not what we promised. We talked about this. What's the deal? And you get over halfway through the epic before Zeus finally reveals his hand to the other gods, and he says, stop it, guys. You keep trying to interfere with what I'm doing. You have to understand, I'm building Hector up so that when Achilles kills him, he can seize eternal glory. Right? I've got to have this incredible antagonist so that you think, Hector, the greatest warrior who ever lived, and then Achilles took him down. So who's the greatest warrior now? That's one thing dragons do in the story for us, right? They give us that worthy antagonist that allows us to define our heroes. In Norse mythology, Odin is looking for the world's chosen. This is the one person who has a chance of averting Ragnarok. And it's very ambiguous whether he's going to keep Ragnarok from happening or just make sure that there's a new birth of a new world after Ragnarok is over. Probably the latter, but Odin's kind of hoping it's the former because Odin doesn't want to die. But the title of the world's chosen, the chosen one out of all of the world, falls upon the one who his other title is Dragon Slayer. And so is looking for the one who is the slayer of the dragon, that's Fafnir specifically. This is the guy upon whom the fate of the gods and of humans is going to hang in Norse mythology. So that's build up the antagonist so that you then see how great your hero is. On the other side of it, it's no secret that we're changed by the difficulties that we encounter and the ways that we respond to them. But even more so, wouldn't be too much to say that we're defined by them. When you ask me about some great hero of the past, whether it be a saint or a missionary or a war hero or whatever else, right, we're going to go right to the things that were their greatest challenges and what they did with them in that moment. If you think about something like Chariots of Fire, or think about the life of Jim Elliot, or think about any of the early Christian martyrs, right? Those are the places where we go to. We talk about the martyrdom of the martyrs, and we talk about maybe some of the great spiritual things they did before the martyrdom came, but really they come to be defined. It's why we call them martyrs even. We're defining them by the great challenge, the great obstacle that was set in front of them to be faithful even to the point of a horrible death. So then too, setting a dragon into the way of your hero, it's not just for the sake of showing how great the hero is, but it's also the specific ways the hero can be changed by the encounter with the dragon. The person who speaks with a dragon is a very different person forever after. We see this in Bilbo in The Lord of the Rings. It's very, very clear in Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea novels where a dragon lord, that's just a name for somebody that dragons will deign to speak to. Right. So I think that's those types of things. It shows that our heroes need things to do. They need things to give them the chance to be heroic. But also, it's the question of what type of story are you involved in? And is it a cool story? And is it a worthwhile story? And how great a story is it? These are questions dragons can answer.
Yeah, and so, talk again, going back to Edmund Spenser, Fairy Queen. First of all, brief shout out. There is an adaptation, a children's retelling of Book One of the Fairy Queen. I have it beautifully illustrated. My kids love it, which is great because some of the depictions of Red Cross Knight fighting the dragon are a little terrifying, but my 4-year-old loves it. But Edmund Spenser, he has a pretty clear, allegorical agenda to get out in the Fairy Queen. But other stories, it's less clear. One of the other readings you mentioned in your syllabus is Beowulf, where Beowulf, obviously the hero, fights Grendel, who's somebody who there's been a lot of scholarly and literary attention to. What is Grendel and Grendel's mother? But then the final monster that he fights, and spoiler alert, this poem was written over 1,000 years ago, so it's on you if you don't know it yet. But spoiler alert, the dragon actually kills Beowulf when Beowulf is an old man. So what kind of role can we take of the dragon there, and as opposed to Grendel? Can we consider Grendel a dragon? What's going on with all that stuff?
You know what's interesting? I don't think we can consider Grendel a dragon, and I think part of what's lacking from Grendel is any sort of cunning at all. There's a lot of pieces of the Beowulf story that go unnoticed, and just one that I want to really draw attention to is that it's not clear that there need to have been any beef with the dragon at all. The whole thing begins when, and this may be familiar if you've read The Hobbit. The whole thing begins when someone sneaks into the dragon's hoard and steals a cup. So the dragon, if you've heard, I don't know if this reminds you of anything. So the dragon comes out and starts, pillages a couple of villages, right? Just sort of tit for tat. By the way, there's a running commentary all through Beowulf about blood feuds and about the tragedies of blood feuds. It's kind of a diatribe against blood feuds. Well, the dragon is just following that script, right? You take from me, I'm going to take from you. So then Beowulf hears about it, and Beowulf goes to fight the dragon. And here's the kicker. When he gets there, the first thing he does is he taunts the dragon to call him out of his cave. He doesn't talk to the dragon. He doesn't attempt to reason with the dragon. He doesn't attempt to in any way come to terms with the dragon, acknowledge what his person did. Listen, you've been grieved. You've retaliated. Let's de-escalate things. He actually goes in there and escalates it right away. He takes a very small number of men with him. He doesn't take the army. He takes like 20 guys. And he won't let them come with him. He goes by himself to face the dragon. The poem makes very clear this is pride, where he wants to face the dragon by himself and beat it and show how great a warrior he is and be glorious in this sort of way. He wants to seize glory one last time, but instead what happens is he gets killed. He's called the shield of his people. When the shield of his people is taken away, they're led away into exile, and their identity is shattered, and there are no more Geats. So it's a very foolish mistake on his part, and his hubris leads to the destruction of his people. And for just that reason, he has no thought of treating with the dragon coming into it. He's decided he's only going to treat the dragon as an enemy. Could things have gone differently if he had approached that dragon cave in a different way? Well, we'll never know. But there's enough in the story as we have it to raise the question and think it's not at all a given that this was the only way out of this.
That is fascinating. That's some nuance I did not catch. So thanks for bringing that up. That is so interesting. But another element you talked about sort of implicitly with the Beowulf tale is something that is also seems to be a pervasive trope in dragon literature, and that is the treasure hoard. You can see it. You can see it. I mean, two famous examples are J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, where Smaug in The Hobbit has a huge treasure hoard, and then we have the dragon in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Tell us what this significance is of this pervasive theme of dragons with their hoard of treasure.
Yeah, I think here we have to touch back again, go back to the Norse aspects of the myths, because Fafnir, which is one of the sort of three great dragons of Norse mythology, was originally not a dragon. He's a person who was cursed and became a dragon. He was cursed by the Rheingold, which is the ring that Odin and Loki, or rather the treasure that Odin and Loki tricked away from the dwarf as they were trying to get their freedom. There's this history of powerful beings having dealings over unimaginable wealth, and a curse therefore coming upon that wealth, and then those mortal humans who then seek after that wealth and find that it transforms them, that it externalizes what's inside of them. The Dawn Treader is great for this, right? I mean, sleeping on a dragon's hoard with dragon's thoughts. It's not clear that just sleeping on a dragon's hoard would be enough to turn you into a dragon. It's not clear that just having dragon thoughts would be enough to turn you into a dragon. It's the conjunction of the two where the magic really happens there. Same thing happens to Fafnir. He's so He lusts after the gold. He winds up killing his brothers for the gold, and the curse of the gold falls on him, and he becomes the dragon Fafnir. And then he warns Sigurd, who then comes and slays him. The world's chosen, remember, slays the dragon. He warns him about the curse of the Rhinegold, and Sigurd doesn't listen. And then his tale also wins into tragedy from there. So in European culture, I think this Norse myth and the Rhinegold is very, very powerful. And that's part of what informs the dragon horde, the nature of a cursed treasure, and that the dragon himself is something of a curse, and that those two, there's a synergy between the treasure and the dragon. And you see it a little bit in The Hobbit, that there's this sense of contamination of the dwarvish horde by the dragon's presence there, and Peter Jackson actually accentuated that in his Hobbit movies and made a sort of mental, psychological curse where this gold is driving Smaug and Thorin mad. So that's one place where that comes from. That's one important part in the history of it anyway. Surely there's more that feeds into that. I don't know that I could say that the Horde is not a part of it before that. And I think as far as that goes, my best guess as to what's going on there is, it's interesting that greed is always a part of the dragon stories. It's interesting that pride is an important part of the dragon stories. Gluttony lines up there, right? They're huge. Yeah. They eat a lot, and they're devouring all the sheep and men and villages and things. The dragons are kind of running their way through the seven deadly sins. And again, if the Genesis connection is this is the individual through whom evil entered into material creation with the necessary help of human wills, then there is sort of the caput draconis, the head of the dragon, is also the caput vitium, the head of the vices. The dragon is the fountain from which all the vices flow in that sense.
Huh. So something related to that I've been sort of brooding over as we've been talking. A little bit of background. Listeners, I'm sorry. I know I talk about this too much already. But I've been working on a book for a while. It's sort of middle grade YA. It involves dinosaurs in this culture. And I'm trying to give the dinosaurs a dragonish flair. So when I was pitching this to publishers, I was looking for example stories like, there's a ton of YA books about dragons. Probably no surprise, but I started reading through a bunch of them. And something that I kept noticing is, first of all, the extent to which a lot of these same themes keep going. It's really remarkable in a lot of ways. The dragons are definitely seen as this sort of ancient source of wisdom. There's always this cunning to them. They're almost always rational and form deep attachments to their human. Basically, if you wanted to do a paint by numbers plot of these, it's X was a normal kid from this peasant village, but then by some happenstance, they hatch a dragon egg. And the dragon, this powerful, magnificent creature, forms an attachment with only X. So now X and the dragon must team up to save the world. Okay. So one of the results of that is the dragons are almost always seen as good guys. So there's more on the sort of the positive aspects of their nature and sort of less on being sort of the archetypal nemesis or ultimate foe that we talked about. Do you think that's a good development? Do you think we're missing something by taking that? What do you think of sort of the contemporary push to make dragons the good guys?
Generally, I like it, as long as we don't lose the other side too. So, one of the things that when I developed this dragon class, someone approached me and said, I'm going to take this class. I wonder, would you mind if I've got some grandchildren? I'd like them to take this class with me. They're 12 to 18 range. And I was thinking, well, we're going to be talking about some pretty adult material here, right? The whole point is to deal with the difficult issues in life and what wisdom looks like and what it looks like to maintain wonder through these challenges. I don't really want to be talking with a 12-year-old about some of that stuff. So I said, okay, I'll make a younger version of the class for folks like that to come in and do. Then another friend comes and says, I just saw you have a class. You made a version for my kid is 10 and would really like to do this. And says, can they, I don't think they'd be ready. Would you be willing to do a class for a younger group as well? I was like, well, yeah, I guess. So now there's 3 dragon classes and they're age appropriate and, some common books between them so that if you were to take, members of a family were to take all the 3 classes, they would have things that they could talk about, which I think would be really cool. But also, some of the books the adults are reading for various reasons, I wouldn't want the teens or the preteens reading. It was particularly working on that last version of it for the preteens. I was picking age-appropriate stories, and I was thinking about the things that I really want to happen out of these courses for all the levels, which is to foster and increase the sense of wonder in the hearts of the students. You take a class on dragons, you need to come away with the conviction that the world is a more magical place than you thought it was before you took the class. And I noticed that as a result of this, every book, every dragon in the preteen class is a helpful dragon.
Yeah.
There are no dragon enemies. In the teen class, there's a mix of helpful and unhelpful dragons. And in the adult class, they're almost entirely unhelpful dragons. And in fact, I think the only helpful adult dragon is Eustace, and he's a special case, right? The dragon Eustace met would certainly not have been very helpful. And so I think that there's a sense in which it's good because dragons don't just stand for danger and evil and destruction and burnination and all these other sorts of things, but that they also do stand for things like greatness and glory and whatnot. So for those reasons, I think it's really good to have some good dragons so that we don't lose those aspects of dragon nature, of what this particular greatness is that we're gesturing to, the dragons are symbols of. But as we get older, I think increasingly we have to face the fact that we're in a fallen world, that we're the ones who broke the world, that, we're not really the heroes of this story. We're the villains seeking redemption in this story. We are going to go to some dark places. Life takes us to dark places. It's actually the point of life. We're being tested, right? God wants to know if we will choose God when it's good and when it's bad. And each one of those has its challenges to it. So I think we need the antagonistic dragons. We need them to keep our sense of wonder alive. We need them to challenge our comfort with the everyday. But also, I think that there's this, the whole medieval thing. You see a dragon, and the obvious thing to do is to kill it. Yeah. There's just no question to ask it. It's there to be slain, right? Carthage must be destroyed. Must it? Right? I mean, in Harry Potter, you don't want to kill a unicorn. Drinking the blood of a unicorn can give you eternal life, but it's a cursed half-life because of the crime against nature that the murder of a unicorn is. Mightn't there be something similar for dragons? Mm-hmm. At least it shouldn't be obvious to us that so magnificent a creature is just for killing, and that's the only use it has. And so I think this trend helps. It may be unfortunate for our generation for getting an unsteady diet of good dragons, but in terms of the entire movement of Western thought and reflection on this point, it's probably a helpful and well-timed intervention.
There's just so much to unpack with the dragons. It's made me think, there should be a whole class. Wait, there is a whole class on it. So thanks so much for walking that through. So closing, we're running low on time, but really quick, I thought it would be great if me and you could give our lists of favorite dragons. Mine's probably going to be lame and basic, but I'll start with mine. First of all, I'm not going to overthink this. One I've been thinking about a lot, Toothless from the How to Train Your Dragon movies, not the book. This is one of the few cases where the book is okay, movies are fantastic. I would love few things more than to have my own pet Toothless and to wander around with him, to just fly around with the saddle. And I think I think those movies do a lot to capture some of the themes we've been talking about, because some of the dragons are definitely good, they're helpful, they form really deep bonds with their humans. Some are gigantic and terrifying and just horrifying. So I think they do a good job of that. Second one, it's a dragon Temeraire from the His Majesty's Dragon book series by Naomi Novak. This is a fascinating series. I'm just a few books into it, but the premise is Napoleonic Wars in this sort of alternate history. Pretty much all history is the same, only dragons are real and people use them in battle. So they fly around, and the dragons are very wise. They're very ancient. They can talk to people. Fascinating stuff. The main dragon is great. My list may go off the rails here. Third one, okay, it's basic. I'm going to say Smaug. Okay, fine. Yes, I know he's from Tolkien, but he's fascinating. Captured my imagination as a kid. I heard a rumor from my Bible teacher in high school that J.R.R. Tolkien based Smaug off the description of the Leviathan in the Book of Job. I don't know if that's true, but I'm passing it on. And finally, Junius, you can laugh at me for this. I give you full permission to laugh. King Ghidorah from Godzilla. He is a giant golden dragon with 3 heads. And even when he's in the sort of silly costume in like the 1970s, he looks terrifying. The latest movies did a great job with him in King of the Monsters. He is
Mhm.
awe-inspiring. He is a force, just like this primal foe for Earth, and he is absolutely terrifying the way he did it. All right, so those are my four. And thank you for only giving me the good-natured chuckle for King Ghidorah. But what are some of your favorite dragons, Junius?
I will. First of all, there's a couple of things we have to get out of the way here. One is that I had to be kind because I'm going to go off the rails on my list too. The second is, so you listeners out there, just email. It's Matthew Melema with your if you want to let him have it for saying that any movie was better than the book. That's where you want to direct those comments. I actually haven't read the How to Train Your Dragon book, so I can't weigh in on that one. I'm going to start with one who's not my favorite, but who I really want to be, and that's Smaug as well. I'd like to meet the younger Smaug. Because the Smaug that we meet, or that Bilbo comes across in The Hobbit, has grown complacent and super haughty and lazy and has been overcome by his greed. There's a very clear moment in The Hobbit when he's decimating Lake Town. And these dragons are armored on the back and not really on the bottom, and he's aware of this. And he has lain on gems for centuries, well, not for centuries, for a very long time, with the express purpose of building up armor under there so that he will be armored above and below. And he boasts about this to Bilbo. Mm-hmm. But this is really funny. It's very clear dragons learn how to fight by turning their back to their enemies when they attack, right? So as you're diving at something, you kind of roll your back towards your enemy so that whatever they're shooting at you hits off the armor, and you're safe. During the description of the attack on Lake Town, Tolkien points out that Smaug, in his rage and in his lust to destroy the town, doesn't bother to turn his back to the town. He doesn't bother to protect himself. And that's why the shot is there for Bard to take, which ends his life. I always wanted Smaug to be more clever. I always wanted him to be more successful in what we see, but all we catch is the dotage of Smaug, as it were, as he has sort of grown fat in his victories and lost all of his. So I imagine that if I could meet the younger Smaug in text, that would be one of my favorite dragons. Sticking in Tolkien's world, Glaurung is quite the dragon, and now that Christopher Tolkien has published The Children of Húrin, we can get a little bit more about him and the ways in which he uses his power of. You could call it hypnosis, but really what he does is he causes you to see through his eyes. And so all of his malice and hate through which he sees the world, you see that way. And in great he takes Turin, Húrin's son, and shows him himself through that vision so that Turin comes to hate himself because of seeing himself the way that Glaurung sees himself. And in this way, he's able to bring about the ultimate fall of the House of Húrin. Very, very cool. And that's using that sort of cleverness. His greatest effect in the text is not the havoc he wreaks, although there's plenty of that with his physical destruction, but it's really that more psychological destruction that he brings about. Okay, well, time for me to go. That's all very respectable, and people can say, yeah, that guy knows what he's talking about. So it's time for me to join you in the gutter, as it were, and say that for me, and these were very formative dragons for me in my youth, the Dragonlance novels of Dungeons and Dragons. Especially the original trilogy, was it Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Falling Midnight or Dawn Night or something, and then Dragons of Spring Dawning. That trilogy, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, the way those dragons are constructed, I love it. You have all of the physical, intimidating power that you expect from a dragon. They're very intelligent. They're spellcasters, so they're wizards and sorcerers. They're wise and smart, and there's malice. There's good and evil ones, and they're nicely color-coded for you so you can tell which ones are which. And then you've got the ones that are not, well, you can't be bothered to pick sides and are really just kind of looking out for themselves. What I always liked about it was that, to me, it turned dragons into a race like humans or like jinn or even like angels that are a race of moral agents. And so you meet a human You don't know if you're meeting a good human or an evil human. Okay, you're meeting an evil human. You don't know if you're meeting a super evil human or just a sort of normal fallen evil human, right? Or that rarest of all things, a saint who's an evil human who's on the way to becoming something cooler. With an angel, if it's an angel or a demon, okay, you can tell what's going on there. But in Arab philosophy, there are these genie, the jinn in the middle, and they have almost angelic-like power, but unlike the angels, they don't fall or stand as a race. And so you don't know whether a particular genie is trying to trick you or trying to help you. And there's that sort of ambiguity about it. And you get that with some of the dragons in Dragonlance as well. So to me, that was a really wonderful place where all of those things came together. You put in a plug for your novel, so I'll throw mine in there too. I also have been working on a novel that I hope to sell sometime in the not too distant future. And there is a dragon that's an important part of that world. And what I've tried to do with that dragon is to encompass some of this ambiguity where he has perpetrated horrors, but he does so in the name of things that he believes are right. And so what does that look like to be that kind of a monster, or to be a monster for a purpose? So my favorite dragons are going to be complex dragons. Those are the ones that I'm looking for. I'm looking for dragons where there's a lot going on with them, where it's meaningful to listen to them talk. You ought to listen to them. Try that first. But you've also got to be careful, because about the most dangerous thing they can do is talk to you.
I like that you went off the rails. I thought the dragons off the rails were interesting. So there you go, everyone. A collection of dragons, some on the rails, some off. All of them worth considering. So, Junius, we're about out of time, like I said, but thank you so much for joining us. I thought this was super interesting. And where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
Go over to juniusjohnson.com. You'll find links to all of my writing. You'll find links to the courses, and you can hop on the mailing list over there, find out when new courses are being offered, when the next registration windows will be for the Dragons classes, all that kind of stuff.
All right, great. And like I said, if you just go in Google search bar, start typing Junius Johnson, click on Junius Johnson Dragons, and you'll be taken to the right place for this course. So, Junius, thank you again for joining us at the table. And, well, as you all can probably guess, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.